Welcome to The Sound of Economics, the podcast series by Bruegel, the Brussels-based economic think tank. This episode is part of our summer 2023 special series, Read with Bruegel. In this series, we have the pleasure of hosting renowned authors who will discuss various economic issues based on their insightful books. We hope that this conversation will inspire you to explore their books and offer you some food for thought during your summer break. My name is Simone Tagliapietra. I am a senior fellow at Bruegel working on energy and climate issues. Joining me today is Dan Yergin, Vice Chairman of S&P Global, with his book, The New Map, Energy, Climate, and the Clash of Nations. Dan, thank you so much for being with us. Welcome to The Sound of Economics.
Well, thank you very much, Simone. I'm very glad to be with you. Thanks for the invitation.
Then let's go straight into the core of our conversation. And let me start perhaps by recalling that in the new map, you provided a kaleidoscopic survey of how the global energy order has been simultaneously shaken by climate change, the revolution in oil and gas, in the shale revolution in oil and gas, and by the pandemic. Now, 2 years since the publication of the book, how do you see this new map evolving as a result of Russia war in Ukraine and of the rising tensions we see between the West and China, namely over critical minerals and supply chains?
Well, thank you. So I think when I was writing the new map, I didn't mean it to be a new map of that moment in the time, but trying to be a new map of the future. And, I focused in on Ukraine and Russia because you could see that that was the most unsettled question with the end of the Cold War, that Vladimir Putin said that Ukraine is not a country. And so, I was trying to explain the whole history of the animosity from the breakup of the Soviet Union. And I did say that Ukraine was the issue most likely to blow up between Russia and the West. And of course, that's happened. I read a note that a member of the Ukrainian parliament wrote saying that, how prophetic the book was, although none of us could have imagined that the war would go on now for 500 days or whatever it is where we are now. The other major question that I think that I really laid out the map is the end of what I call the WTO consensus, the sense that, all of the major economies were together in a sort of the second age of globalization benefiting, and its replacement by great power competition. And what I did is kind of provided a map and explained where it came from, including going back 90 years to how the South China Sea ended up being this point of great contention and imminent risk between the US and China. I think where I was in the book is kind of where we're now going, because of course I also pointed to how minerals was going to emerge, big subject of contention, and one of the potential constraints on the energy transition. I think that we're seeing the uptake of electric cars happening faster, and China's interest in the electric car was not only because of climate and energy and pollution, it was so that it could compete in the global automobile market. And it's striking to see that China now, partly because it has this new market in Russia, is now the world's largest exporter of cars ahead of Japan and Germany. And then the big question was how to think about this energy transition and why it's different from all others. And I think that's very much on the table given the events of the last 2 years.
Absolutely. So energy security, the green transition, and of course, the industrial repercussion of all of this. I think we could start slowly unpacking these three extremely important and relevant areas, and maybe we could start from the energy security angle. And while looking at the events of the last, more than 500 days of war now, I think it is pretty shocking to see how the European energy map has been changing and how Europe managed to decouple from Russian gas and Russian oil without those dramatic repercussions on the economy that, recession and all of that many feared at the beginning of this process. Now, if you look at the current situation from the Russian perspective, so looking at Russia in itself, how do you see the Russian energy outlook. Do you think that the days of Russia as a global energy superpower are over, or do you think that Russia will manage to reorient itself towards the east, also when it comes to natural gas, on top of what we are already seeing, of course, happening with the oil market?
I think we're going to have to come back and unpack your question because there's a lot in that and raise the question, has Europe actually gotten through this upheaval? I mean, the German economy is said to be in recession right now, and the competitiveness of German industry or European industry is really under question, both because of what's happened in energy and also, by the way, with the IRA, which we'll come to in the United States. But on Russia, so in Russia, I have an exchange that Putin actually had with my wife. She's a specialist on Russia. She asked him, is Russian energy superpower? And I quote him in the book saying, oh, I don't like that term. It sounds too Cold Warish. Well, it is Cold Warish times right now. Russia was an energy superpower, but I don't think it is anymore because it's lost its most important market, Europe, and it's lost the influence that came with that. So Russia continues to be a major energy producer. It has a lot of stranded gas. It's going to take time to be able to shift some of its gas exports to Europe, to Asia from Europe, because you need pipelines, and the Chinese are not going to give the Russians a sweet deal. But I think Russia ends up more an energy dependency, an economic dependency of China. And China's the market. Obviously, India has become a major market for Russian oil. And it's a good deal for India because India imports 85% of its oil, so oil at discount. But I think that the sense that the influence, the stature that Russia had as an energy exporter is that's one of the many things that Putin has destroyed. Really, Russia was not integrated with China; it was integrated with Europe, and that integration is over, and it's not going to come back easily.
So maybe picking up the European part of the question, what we have seen last year has been a dramatic reduction of the flows of gas from Russia to Europe that was entirely decided by the Russian side, of course. We still see certain amount of exports of gas from Russia to Europe, namely LNG. LNG represents today still a major export of Russia to the European Union. Russia remains the third largest LNG suppliers to Europe after the United States and Qatar, of course. Do you expect also this part of the trade to end in the coming months/years?
I think Europe has the same problem that Japan does, that you do need that incremental gas. The Europeans said, we don't want your oil. Putin said, we're not going to give you any gas. You know, we have a big three of LNG, which is Qatar, Australia, and the United States. Russia was on course to be the big fourth. But I think that this is where the sanctions have actually hurt Russia more than it's hurt its oil industry, because I think it puts a ceiling. They just don't have the technology to expand their LNG business. So I think, what was it? Europe was getting about 7% of its energy, of its gas from LNG from Russia, something like that.
Yes, exactly, 7%, yes.
And I would think that continues, just as in Japan, they said, you know, it's about 10% of their LNG, but if we don't have it, our electricity is going to be threatened. So I would think that would continue. But I think that the bulk of Russian gas, of course, was pipeline gas. Basically, Putin has stranded it.
Yeah, of course, when it comes to the LNG, the interesting question is whether Europe will take action to sanction that, right? We have seen over the last few months certain political pressures coming up to companies that are importing Russian LNG to basically reduce this in the future and certainly not renew the contracts, because Europe has now this target of phasing out all fossil fuel imports from Russia by 2027. So whether or not there will be an acceleration on the political pressure to act on Russian LNG remains to be seen. But in case this materializes in the coming months, do you think the US side, so do you think US LNG will be there to meet the gap?
Well, I think, you know, then it comes down to the question of the weather. At our CERAWeek conference, I asked the CEO of one of the major European energy companies, actually the new CEO of Shell, about this question of next winter in Europe. He said, hope is not a strategy. And I think that really stuck with me, that it will depend very much on the weather and the level of economic activity. We just did our big Energy Asia conference in Malaysia, and then I was in Japan. And clearly there's concern. Will there be a bidding match between Asia and Europe for LNG? I mean, a lot of people in Europe kind of just viscerally didn't like the idea of the shale revolution in the US. And as you know, at one point, one of the major European countries rejected a cargo of US LNG. This is before the crisis because it was shale. Now you can see that, in fact, US LNG has become, as your question suggests, one of the foundations of European energy security and one of the foundations of the European economy. And thank goodness the shale revolution occurred, because otherwise the world would be in a much different position than it is today. We're certainly seeing projects going ahead in the US and contracts being signed. And I was struck at our big CERAWeek conference in March in Houston, the number of senior Europeans, including from European governments, who were there basically to suss out the LNG, how do we get more LNG supplies from the United States? US LNG has become part of the overall security system between North America and Europe.
Absolutely. And the way we at Bruegel have portrayed the current European gas security of supply architecture is basically being based on two main pillars. On the one hand, as you correctly say, US LNG being by now half of the LNG supply into Europe, and on the other, gas demand reduction. I mean, there was this unprecedented decision last year by the European ministers to coordinate gas demand reduction, and of course, that was also mainly happening because of the very high prices we have seen throughout the continent, and that persists today. Now, the extent to which this is the result of efficiency and fuel switching rather than industrial outcome getting lower, namely in gas-intensive sectors, depends on the different countries. But what you raised before, I think it's a very important point, is a structural change that this new energy situation in Europe is having as an impact on the industry. In short, we might have been good at weathering the storm, but now we need to live with a new normal where the gas prices in Europe remain high, and certainly much higher than in the United States, even vis-a-vis the levels before the crisis. So this opens perhaps a new reflection on how the European industrial map will have to change according to the new energy reality, where cheap Russian gas is not there anymore, and therefore the energy cost will be higher than before.
Energy security as a concern in Europe and North America fell off the table. In Europe, it fell off the table because we could shut down our nuclear power in Germany, we can rely on Russian gas, it's part of an overall relationship. In the US, it fell off the table because the shale revolution took the United States from being the world's largest importer of oil to the world's largest producer of oil and natural gas. And now it's back. And as you say, part of the strategy of dealing with the emergency in Europe was demand was done. And I think our numbers are that something like European industrial gas demand went down like something like 27%. I mean, that's pretty extraordinary. And it will be sorted out how much of that was really recession, lower economic activity, how much efficiency, how much switching, by the way, to coal or oil. But when I talk to CEOs of major European companies, they're kind of depressed right now, just about how do they stay competitive in Europe and what does that mean for jobs. It will become clearer, but Europe is at a competitive disadvantage of not having been able to rely on inexpensive Russian gas.
Absolutely. And if we think about history and how industrial development has always followed also the availability of cheap energy and plentiful available energy resources from coal to hydro, that certainly opens new questions about whether, for example, new industrial productions in Europe should be relocated, for example, in the more sunny areas in the south, rather than in certain African countries where we do have a huge renewable energy potential. And this is a new geography, a new industrial geography that might well happen in the coming years and might have winners and losers, of course.
Yeah, and if you say who's going to have the biggest demographic positive, it's Africa. which is its population is going to grow enormously. And it, along with India, will have the preponderance of young people. Compare that, look at the Chinese economy now. It was supposed to rebound and it was going to pull up the global economy just as it did after the 2008 financial crisis. It's not happening. And you see that China is not having the economic growth that was expected, reflected in commodity prices. Part of that has to do with demography, not enough young people, and the population will eventually begin to decline. So it is interesting that you point to Africa, which might take on a much more dynamic role in the global economy.
Absolutely. And if I actually made, further elaborate on that and also push the conversation in this direction, how do we see the future interplay and partnership between Europe and Africa? Because one of the key results from, an international energy strategy perspective from the energy crisis certainly has been to increase the role of Africa in the European strategy here. So last year we have seen Mario Draghi and many other prime ministers and President von der Leyen himself touring a number of African countries.
Don't forget Chancellor Scholz as well on that list.
Oh, exactly, absolutely. And Macron, of course, President Macron. On the one hand, to secure additional gas supplies, of course, but always with, an attached memorandum of understanding on, renewable energy cooperation, green hydrogen, and all of that. So do you think there is here the case and an opportunity for Europe to build really a new partnership with Africa when it comes to energy, understanding that Africa has a very different set of priorities, of course, than Europe, and namely the energy access one?
I think that it is interesting as you phrase it. You do see a pivot in the map. And of course, Europe also has to be concerned about the immigration side. It's a complicated and it's a fraught relationship. And of course, it also has a colonial history that even complicates it further. What I find and quite struck by, we've been doing a project called the Global Energy Solutions. What we find is that the developing world really feels its voice hasn't been heard on energy, actually. And one of the things I write about in the new map, and again, what I try to do is to show things didn't just happen yesterday, develop over several years, is we used to talk about the North-South divide, which was after the oil crisis in the 70s, which was about commodity prices. Now I think there's a new North-South divide on the subject of energy and on climate policy. And it's your word, the word you use, priorities. They have different priorities. I chaired a session with a group of African energy ministers. And one of the ministers talked about the fact they need to build a natural gas pipeline so women don't have to gather wood 3 hours a day, so you don't have indoor air pollution, and you need it for economic growth. And so on the one hand, Europeans come to them and say, oh, can you give us some LNG? But on the other hand, our banks will not give you financing to build a natural gas pipeline. And this minister said, what do they expect us to do? By not giving us finance, they've taken away the ladder. What are we supposed to do? Jump or fly? Just this Energy Asia conference we just did in Malaysia. It's the same thing. Where's the voice of Asia? Where's the voice of developing countries? It's different priorities. They have to worry about economic growth, poverty reduction, health. If their GDP per capita is 1/20th that of people living in Brussels, they can't afford to be only focused on climate. They have to be focused on these other issues as well. And so I think that complicates the discussion. And there is this notion in a developing country, can you just skip to wind and solar, or do you really need to have some conventional energy resource development as well to reach a level where you can more easily absorb renewable energy? And it's a very different perspective. And the thing we keep hearing is that their voice, their perspective isn't really being heard.
Absolutely. I also see what you say, namely last year, after years that many of the Western and European leaders been saying to African countries not to invest anymore in oil and gas and all of that, going there to all of a sudden ask for new gas exports was seen as a major contradiction in terms, right? And now the question, in my view here, is can Europe, but also the United States, and that's exactly what, by the way, is agreed in theory, also at the G7 level, but then in practice we know this is much more difficult. Can the West or the global North provide a new model of energy infrastructure development in the global South that could also be alternative, for example, to the one proposed to these countries by China, and a model that integrates energy development for energy access, making use of the fact that today we have competitive renewable energy sources, namely solar, that can offer certainly an interesting option. Not the only one, but one of the interesting options for electrification in a continent like Africa, for example, together with the need to have new supply chains, namely when it comes to minerals and to clean technologies. Let me give you one example of minerals. We know that the current supply chains are very much structured in a system where China does, for example, the mining of these minerals in a number of African countries, but then the refining happens in China. So these minerals get shipped to China where the processing of them happen. Maybe there might be the case to invest in the setup of these processing facilities in these countries, so to also create some local value and jobs creation, and also meet in that way the diversification that both Europe and the United States are looking for.
Again, there are several avenues in your comments. So I think let me take the mineral question. In the new map, I pointed to the minerals question and said, to some degree, we're moving from what they always call big oil to big shovels. And we did this copper study where we tried to, in a very granular way, say, okay, take the 2050 goals Europe has, take the 2050 goals that the US has, look at a technology basis and say, what do you need for copper? And come to the conclusion, every electric car uses 2.5 to 3 times more copper. And if you add it all up, you said, well, you're going to have to double copper production by the late 2030s to meet these goals. What is the chance of that? 3 countries produce 40% of world oil: Russia, US, Saudi. 2 countries produce 40% of copper: Chile and Peru. In Peru, I believe the president is still in jail. And Chile, the president doesn't like the mining industry. He ran against it. So are you going to be able to step up the minerals? Now, the processing, absolutely. The US mines some copper, gets sent to China for processing. Indonesia, wants to go up the value chain on nickel in exactly the way you described. And who's taking the lead on it? Chinese companies. They're the ones who are building the facilities. And remember, Chinese state SOEs don't have the same financial imperatives that Western companies do in terms of investment. There's a different time frame, different returns, and so forth. I think what's happening is that the new supply chains for net zero are becoming increasingly entangled with the new great power competition, and it gets more complicated. And if I can bring up one other thing, when I was at Harvard, I had a mentor named Raymond Vernon, who was a famous international economist, and he came up with the notion of what he called the obsolescent bargain, which is, let's say the Bruegel Institute is actually also a mineral company, and Bruegel goes and invests $6 billion in some country to build a mineral mine. And then you have Bruegel in this country, you have a banquet, you have little flags on the table, and everybody toasts and says what a great relationship this is. Then there's an election, and the populists come to power, and the old guys are out, and the new guys are in, and they want to change the terms. And that bargain that you struck, that Bruegel Mining Incorporated struck, they said, we don't want that. We want to negotiate a new contract. And suddenly the other $2 billion that you're going to invest, you don't invest anymore, or it gets stymied. So I was reading a report saying, oh, there's plenty of reserves. Well, yeah, there are plenty of reserves, but that doesn't pay attention to what happens above ground. I'm giving a long answer here, but add one other thing. I was talking to one of the CEO of one of the largest institutional investors in Europe. And he was saying, we get slammed for investing in oil and gas. Oh, but by the way, we also get slammed for investing in mining. So in other words, the message is the real world is a lot more complicated than it looks like when people do scenarios.
Exactly. And when it comes to all the current narratives of de-risking, not to talk about decoupling, right? I think one needs to be extremely humble, no? Also in looking at the the facts and the difficulties that there are in Europe, but also I guess in the United States and elsewhere, in developing these supply chains, social acceptability, a big issue, the economics, another big issue, and the fact that we are running 10 years beyond China here.
Right. I think that one of the characteristics of this 30 years, the second age of globalization that we've been in, is the development of incredibly complex supply chains that I think I was talking to the CEO of one company, said until 2020, supply chains were just a matter of efficiency. He said then they become strategic issues. And people didn't realize how integrated they are. We have a map of supply chains for auto parts. It looks like a bowl of spaghetti, as these parts travel from one place to another. So much more integrated. I think people just don't realize how complicated it is to unwind them. And yet I will be in political meetings where people say, oh, we could change our supply chains. It's pretty complicated, and you're really kind of unwinding 30 years of globalization.
Yeah, absolutely. And if I may actually, look at another aspect of the green transition, I think that in the new map, you very eloquently illustrated how throughout history energy transitions were really largely driven by economic and technological advantages. They were not policy made, they were not policy induced, and certainly didn't have a deadline.
Right. That's a very important point, yes.
Which is a very important point. Now we are in a green transition that resembles a sort of industrial revolution against a deadline. And it is a green transition that also started as a policy-driven revolution that then gets technological when there is no green premium anymore in certain technologies, when the technologies can just go ahead alone without policy support because they are just cost competitive. But what we have seen in renewables, it was a huge policy push at the beginning, same for electric cars and so on. But that is how it started in many segments.
I just add that I think the policy push is still there. If you look at the pollution and mileage regulations on internal combustion engines, that's to drive up the price and squeeze them. And EVs are still, one way or the other, being significantly subsidized, but it's moving much faster than would have been thought. I think the automakers are actually looking at a 2035 deadline, can't have internal combustion engines. And so that's a pretty powerful policy driven. I mean, we talk about a shale revolution. There's also been a solar revolution. To have solar go down 90% in cost, of course, on the back of Chinese manufacturing. But, wind is so much more economical. The scale of wind is so much greater. So all of these, it's economics, technology, and policy, but the weights change.
Exactly. And do you see this as a risk for the future of the green transition? I mean, the fact that policy here matters much more than it used to be in the previous energy transformations. Is this a source of risk? Or
one of the things I try to do in the new map is say, okay, everybody's talking about energy transition. How does this energy transition compare to every other one? And I went out wearing my economic historian hat on a limb and said the energy transition began in 1709 in January, when an English metalworker found that you could make better iron using coal rather than wood. But as you say, these unfolded over a century, and it was really energy addition. Oil overtakes coal as the world's number one energy source in the 1960s. And today the world uses 3 times as much coal. Last year was the highest ever. So in a quarter of a century, it entirely changed the base of the industrial society. Obviously, we have things like the IRA in the States, which is really trying to turbocharge its policy, but it's very much incentive driven, not regulation driven, which is a big difference from Europe, of course. In other words, I think the direction is clear. The incentives for research and development and new technologies are clear. But I think you got to keep in mind scale, $100 trillion world economy. You got to keep in mind the mineral constraint, which I think 2 years ago people were not thinking about. You've got to keep in mind this north-south divide. 80% of the world's population do not live in the industrial north. And by the way, energy security. I was talking to the CEO of one of the major Asian energy companies, and this CEO said, my fundamental mission is energy security for my country. And we better not underestimate that requirement. We know that this crisis with Russia has created for the European economy. Look what it's done to developing countries who couldn't afford LNG, who had to go back and burn coal or have more blackouts.
Absolutely. And when you mentioned that, the fact that solar, the LCOE for solar decreased by 90% over the last 15 years. I think it's 75% in the case of onshore wind. I mean, these massive cost reductions were in a way also the result of a sort of, let's say, unwanted international coordination, right? I think we had a huge degree of subsidies into the research of these technologies in the United States, namely after the 70s, but also in laboratories funded by the governments in Germany, Japan, and so on. Then we have a huge wave of subsidies in Europe in the late 90s, in all the 2000s. And of course, then China came on top of all of these and started to produce these solar panels at scale, reaching over capacity and therefore slashing the cost further. And so there was this dimension of international coordination that was not planned by policymakers, right? It happened pretty spontaneously. And in the case of solar panels, the Germany didn't oppose this force of gravity, didn't really even pick up the battle with the Chinese on solar panels because they understood there was no comparative advantage on their side to produce these products home. Now we are entering a new era where geopolitical competition is increasingly focused exactly on these supply chains. And we see that very clearly with, again, the de-risking narratives we have around in the West, the related policies, the IRA in itself, the attempted European response to that. Do you think these geopolitical dimension of supply chains that is increasing as we speak will actually end up slowing down the green transition, breaking these international collaborations, or might actually be a booster?
Well, let me first, I love your phrase, unplanned coordination. I have a very specific story. In my previous book, The Quest, I asked the question, where did the modern wind industry come from? Where did the modern solar industry come from? And I remember when writing it, I talked to the CEO of Q Cells, which was a German solar company, solar PV company. And it was the largest one in the world when I started writing the book. By the time I finished the book, it had gone bankrupt because of the Chinese undercutting it. Germany and Spain subsidized the establishment of the Chinese solar industry. And that's, if you look at it historically, that's what happened. There's still the remarkable, really kind of unexplained question of how did the Chinese drive down the cost so much? Was it manufacturing scale, know-how? Was it very tight coordination with their supply chains? How much was it that the local governments would give them free land and so forth? So you had subsidies for solar going to consumers in Europe and the US, and basically subsidies going to the Chinese manufacturers. You know, are we going to start to see on solar what we're seeing in semiconductors? Is it fissuring? I mean, look at the oil market. When the oil price cap was first proposed on Russian oil, you know what? It's really worked. But what it's done is it means we now no longer have a global oil market. We have two separate oil markets to a considerable degree. And I think you're asking, will we start to have this fissure? You know, is India going to be satisfied importing solar panels from China? What about the US? Are we going to see, well, we're seeing it, look on chips where you're seeing subsidies and counter subsidies. The IRA in the US is kind of generational potentially in its impact. There's never been really, in modern times, any legislation, anything that one can think of like this that's so neutral and so agnostic, unlike the European taxonomy, which is not agnostic. And it just says, figure out new ways to handle molecules, figure out new ways to handle electrons. And, you know, we're going to give you enormous incentives to do that. We've calculated that $220 billion of capital investments have been announced because of the IRA in the US. I mean, I can cite you European companies who are now doing projects in the US because of that and not in Europe. So Europe should be concerned about that. I mean, I think this second age of globalization, the WTO consensus, I call it in the new map, has served the world very well. You know, your unplanned coordination has really delivered great benefits. And I think as geopolitics gets more complicated, it's going to be disruptive in ways that we can foresee and maybe in ways we can't foresee.
Yeah, and I think this is one of the most tricky questions policymakers need to face, at least on the European side of the Atlantic, because while thinking about how to respond to the IRA, there is the sense that our view of the world based on comparative advantage, economic efficiency, and open trade, somehow we might be the last one playing by that rule. And therefore, we need to inject economic resilience or strategic autonomy, as we define it in Europe, into this equation. But striking the balancing act between economic efficiency and geopolitical resilience that might also come at a cost is not something that is trivial for policymakers to do.
I mean, you can see two problems. One is how does it respond to this massive thing called the IRA, the magnetic force of the IRA? And secondly, I mean, while the U.S. is very connected with China and trade, the trade with China is strategically more important to Europe than it is to the United States. Europe doesn't want to be stuck in the middle. So I think Europe needs a period of deep rethinking, of reorientation, because the world that we've been accustomed to since the Berlin Wall came down, that world is gone, and we're in a different world. And that's why I thought we needed a new map, as I said, not only where we are, but where we're going. And era of great power competition, in some ways, even the name of it kind of invokes that pre-World War I age. In some ways, it's very different, of course, very different, but it also resonates with people can make mistakes that have very high costs. I mean, case in point, Vladimir Putin made at least 4 major miscalculations, and what it's cost him, as one of his senior economic people privately told him, he's thrown away 23 years of economic integration with the West.
Yeah, absolutely. And that was certainly also, I think, the approach of Germany and many other countries in Europe, no? That this economic interdependence would somehow also ensure political stability.
And, I don't think it was wrong. I mean, look back on it. What was the choice? To leave Russia with nuclear weapons in some sort of chaos? But, we'll never know whether what happened was because Putin was isolated for 2 years with COVID and only talked to people who reinforced his imperial fantasies, or whether this would have happened anyway. But peace through trade with Germany, going back to Willy Brandt, that's partly what led to the end of the Cold War and the end of the Soviet Empire, was, opening it up so people could breathe. One of the things now is you have a whole generation of Russians who thought they were part of the international world who are now going to be sealed in a Putin prison, really.
So, as we are getting to the end of our conversation, then I would like to, if I may, to ask you the following question. You are one of the finest connoisseurs of the global energy system and its historical development. And when you think at the role of technology in driving the green transformation we are in, no? You know that often the economic debate on the green transition is polarized between green growth and degrowth, and technology and the optimistic or less optimistic view of the technological capability to deliver is at the core of this discussion. When you think at this, are you an optimist? Do you think technology and technological evolution will allow the world to get to net zero without compromising our lifestyle and shrinking our economy? Or is this something that is out of reach?
Well, maybe in between. I mean, by nature and personality, I'm an optimist. I think the ultimate answers are technology, and amazing things happen. I mean, that's why I looked at wind and solar in the Quest. I mean, they took 30 years to go from, infant industries. It was only around 2010, 2012 that they really took off. All the things that are going on, and there's never been as much effort going into it. It's just that it takes time for them to develop. So I think the direction is there. There's somebody that named Jean Pisani-Ferry, who are one of the founders of the Bruegel Institute. And I've been very impressed by his writings about timing and pacing. You don't want to try and push things so fast that as you end up with what he called in one of his papers, adverse economic shocks that create intolerable situations for policymakers. And I wonder if in the autumn of 2021, before the invasion of Ukraine, we were seeing the first energy crisis of the energy transition. So I think you need motivation, you need dedication, you need focus on these objectives, but you need, I think, to deal with the realities. And, I think several realities have emerged in the last couple of years that you can't just wave away. And by the way, the goal is 2050. Can I remind that India's goal is 2070, China's goal is 2060, Indonesia's goal is 2060, Nigeria's goal is 2060. You're talking about a lot of emissions there. So, whether you're going to hit the precise year, the direction is there. You do need to figure out how to use molecules as well as electrons.
Absolutely, because we need both, and for a long time. Dan, thank you so much for this conversation. Again, let me remind to all our listeners the new map, Energy, Climate and the Clash of Nations, certainly an extremely recommended reading for the summer in case you haven't read this wonderful book. Thanks a lot for tuning in to The Sound of Economics to you all. Let me remind that you can read all our analyses on our website, www.bruegel.org. Thanks a lot for joining The Sound of Economics, and until next time, bye-bye.